So, hoping this video finds you all very well. Today I am going to be discussing Rankine's interview in the New Yorker with Alexandra Schwartz, which we read for today, as well as giving you some of my thoughts on Rankine's Citizen, an American Lyric. Schwartz begins by talking about Langston Hughes' poem, Let America Be America Again. She talks about Rankine's Citizen, an American Lyric, and recounts these incidents that Rankine goes through of everyday acts of racism that Rankine writes about in the second person. The essay goes on to categorize Rankine's work as describing primarily a fine line between being invisible and being too visible. She then talks about the poem's cover image as a symbol which presents an individual or a group of individuals while at the same time undermining the personhood of that individual or group of individuals. And then she starts her interview with Rankine, which precedes the actual publication of Citizen or American Lyric. And she starts by asking about Rankine's decision to go to Ferguson, Missouri. Rankine explains that it was the shooting of Michael Brown that brought her to Ferguson, despite having been invited there many times in the past, or having been invited there, I think she says, a couple of months ago. Rankine then talks about Langston Hughes, stating that for her, he is the poet of the people. He expresses the feeling of the man on the street as opposed to the talented 10. Rankine likes best that Hughes draws attention in that poem to an America which never existed for certain segments of the population. She claims that there are two Americas. I assume what she means by this is that there is one America for minorities and that there is another America for those with what Rankine says is mainstream white privilege. She expresses a sadness by the sense that people feel some things are inherently not their problem. And for me, at least, her use of the second person throughout her poetry has always transformed the acts of everyday racism that she writes about, that she discusses, into moments of forced engagement. Like a few years ago, I read an essay on Rankine, actually, and I can't remember where, but in it described that forced participation that Rankine facilitates and discussed her use of repetition throughout the text as a way to exhaust her readers in the same way that the subjects she's discussing are exhausted by these minuscule acts of racism. So we can see this in the Serena Williams segment when Venus repeats, no, 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 or when Rankine writes, are you serious? She is serious, and so on. But I think that the notion of repetition in Rankine's work exhausting us applies to the kind of materialization into her readers' lives that Rankine is sort of obsessed with facilitating. And I can talk some more about that later, after I finish summarizing the New Yorker article. Rankine talks also about her use, or just, she talks about the internet as well as poetry, not specifically her use of them, but just these things as entities in the world, as underground electricities or currents. The interviewer and Rankine express my same thoughts on that use of the second person, as I was just talking about. Rankine clarifies that her goal for the second person, to destabilize the immediate ability to say, that's not my experience, is why she uses the you. Rankine talks also, and this part did throw me off a bit because it wasn't immediately apparent to me when I was reading the poetry, but Rankine talks about the notion that African Americans started out as property. So if I were in class today, I would probably raise that as a question because I don't have anything myself to say about that. For Rankine, as she says, Citizen came out of watching little fast moments of racism that lead to, in some cases, what she calls the buildup or erasure, or that increase in invisibility or dehumanization. And then she ends rather abruptly with a brief discussion of dehumanization, or moments when she realizes and this might be the most intense part of the whole interview, so it's very strange to me that she ends on it without actually making any conclusions about the statement, but she talks about dehumanization, or moments when she realizes that she or other minorities are not only invisible, but also not human to another person. And then the interview pretty much ends, so that's that. I think it could have gone on for a lot longer. Um, yes, and yeah, I mean, there are so many things that she doesn't talk about in this interview, things that she kind of alludes to, or things that seem like a natural segue into my thoughts or other things that I noticed in the text, but that she never really gets to, or the interviewer doesn't allow her to get to, or that it just isn't included. So, like, Rankine's thoughts in the New Yorker interview and her poetry's ideas of invisibility and visibility and dehumanization have often resonated for me, because I've read this a couple times before as somewhat eco-critical issues. Excuse me. Maybe because I first read her text years ago through an eco-critical lens. But I think the Hurricane Katrina episode is especially helpful in thinking through what I read as environmental racism. So from pages 82 to 87, um, in my book at least, Rankine paints ecological risk as something specified for or directed at those who lack mainstream white privilege. Excuse me. Yeah, and she mentions in her interview this mainstream white privilege. I already talked about that. But it's especially evident that the risk, the environmental risk, is posed specifically to Black or poor bodies when she describes the Hurricane Katrina wreckage as made up of largely Black or poor bodies. In fact, I remember reading Citizen alongside Foucault's History of Sexuality a number of years ago, and in that, Foucault essentially defines a citizen in one way as someone who is subject to a state's right to foster life or disallow it to the point of death, which for me is really quite affecting when I read for it in Rankine's Citizen, in that invisibility she depicts, which is a way of disallowing life, and in some cases, like those of Hurricane Katrina or Ferguson, actually explicitly is an act of disallowing life. And then going back to the forced participation that Rankine facilitates with her text, it's hard for me, and I think it should be hard for anyone to read the poem without interacting with it, both on like a lyrical level through her use of that second person that I talked about earlier, or the repetition that exhausts us just as the poem's subjects are exhausted, but also on a more physical level through the scripts that she presents or the images. And the scripts actually go along with, and I didn't realize this the first time that I read it, videos that you can actually watch on the internet. So in this way, the videos that Rankine creates actually allow the experiences of her subjects to be shared in multifarious ways, to transcend distances through that power of the internet, like she talks about in her New Yorker interview. Yeah. So to conclude, I always find this poem, or this series of poems, or a criticism, or however you want to categorize it, because it's kind of impossible to categorize, as difficult to simplify. And I don't think Rankine herself knows what she wants readers to do with it. But for me, it's important to think about the whole thing, not in terms of little acts of racism that go on an everyday basis, but as acts that may be quick in, in solidarity or alone, but actually facilitate that disallowing of life or play into what we read in like literary theory with Nixon about slow violence, be it on an environmental level or a social level or a political level or what have you. So I hope we get into that in class. I also hope we don't ignore the multimedia aspects of Citizen, because it is clearly a very interactive text, and I think there's a reason for that. And yeah, have a great class, guys.